When we name species, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in future chapters and also in this chapter, it's based on similarities in embryologic development, characteristics that they have as adults, and also as we increase in our technology on proteins and DNA sequences as well. All living organisms fit into 3 domains. So bacteria, archaea, and eukaryota are the 3 domains. And then out of those, there are lots of different kingdoms. We'll look more at the kingdoms in eukaryotes later on in the semester. We'll look at protists, plants, fungus, and animals. And we'll also look at some phyla of specifically animals and some plants in class. And if we look at a zebra and a giraffe, they have the same domain, the same kingdom, the same phyla, the same class. They're both mammals, and then it changes after that for their name. Usually, when we refer to something by its species name, we're just using the genus and species, clear down here at the bottom, the main identifiers that separate different organisms. Humans, for example, are of the genus Homo and the species Sapiens. So we're Homo sapiens would be our scientific classification. It's not always easy to define species because you have lots of complicating factors. If you're looking at things like bacteria, they are asexual, so they just copy their DNA and divide. And then these will copy their DNA and divide. And because they're asexual, it is more difficult to classify them, and there's some crossovers there. So even today, there are lots of bacteria that are difficult to classify. Also, looking at fossil species, if we don't have living organisms around, it's really hard to determine sometimes just by looking at the bones. Perhaps the bones of these 2 fossils look different, but we don't know for sure if that means that they couldn't reproduce in the wild. So fossil species can be hard to classify, which is why you'll hear different reports on different numbers of dinosaur types, things like that, because it's really hard to determine based on just skeletal differences if they could have reproduced in the wild, even if they look different or even if they look the same. It's hard to know for sure if they were the same species. Also, if one species has changed into another gradually over time, it's hard to put a line in here to define exactly when that is one species versus another, especially if you have everything connecting it in between. Ring species are notoriously difficult. The species starts in one location, perhaps migrates around a mountain chain. Then it will encounter slightly different environmental conditions as it moves, and this can take thousands of years. And when it comes back to the original location, these 2 may not be able to interbreed. However, back along the chain, they could stepwise interbreed all the way back to the beginning. So those species are very hard to classify. Where do you draw the line between this species and that one? Also, hybrid species, if 2 different classified species are similar enough that they could reproduce, and then that becomes a little bit foggier. If they produce fertile offspring, should they really be classified as different species, even if they look completely different? If they produce viable, fertile offspring, technically they're the same species. Looking at the history of life and attempts to kind of organize and classify different species, we use phylogenies. And we'll talk quite a bit about phylogenies, but historically they were used, or they were assembled using embryological development and characteristics, and now we've added DNA and proteins and other molecular techniques too. But this just shows how things are related. Each one will have a point of a common ancestor, and then it will diverge. So the last common ancestor between fish and mice is clear back here on this time scale. So time increases as we go up. Then we have a common ancestor here of birds, humans, rats, and mice. Next common ancestor of humans, rats, and mice, and a common ancestor of rats and mice. So it shows the relative relationship. Also, it does not show what's more primitive or what's more advanced, because at any of these ancestor points you could swivel it. So if we wanted the human to be over here at the edge of our chart, we would just turn it at this common ancestor here, just spin that and put the human at the outside edge. But that doesn't change any of the connecting relationships. They're all still the same distances and the same pattern away from each other. You can construct phylogenies between different organisms, and these are evolutionary trees. And again, this is using comparative anatomy, starting with looking at how the embryo develops all the way to the adult, and also now bringing in DNA and protein sequencing. And what's really cool is the DNA and protein information, so molecular cutting-edge techniques, are supporting information from comparative anatomy that was done 200 years ago. So it's really neat that this modern information is just adding support to what was done historically to classify species. But using all those techniques, here is a kind of general phylogeny for all different kind of major domains. So we have bacteria, first to evolve, kind of common ancestor of everything else. The next one is archaea, and the archaea would actually be a common ancestor to all the eukaryotes. And then we have protists, plants, fungus, and animals, and we'll talk a lot more about these in future chapters. In fact, that's the rest of your semester in a nutshell right there, looking at all of these different groups. So again, these are based on morphology, and that's just comparing characteristics and kind of how they develop, and comparative anatomy, so looking at the adults and comparing those, and DNA-based trees, either DNA or protein. And we can construct these trees using all of these different techniques combined. Looking at structures, and these are terms that we're already familiar with because I've mentioned convergent evolution before and homologous traits. Homologous traits will start from a common ancestor, and gradually, because of different environmental conditions, that characteristic or trait will change so that it looks completely different coming from the same ancestor. Convergent evolution is kind of the opposite. They start at different points, but then are faced with similar environmental challenges, and so they find the same solution. So mammals' wings and insect wings, they are convergent. They found the same solution. If you look at elephants, their most closely related species to things like African elephants are the African golden mole, and going back a little bit further, the common shrew. So these two had a common ancestor, and they diverged. We're faced with completely different conditions. One got big, the other got small, and so they diverged. So those would be homologous. When we look at evolution, kind of bring that into our species concept, what most people think of when they hear evolution, they automatically think of macro evolution. So macroevolution, large scale changes, huge things occurring, different species. However, that's not how evolution actually occurs. Evolution occurs at the micro level, just tiny small changes to let an organism adapt. So microevolution would be kind of each of these steps between the shapes. So just small scale changes that gradually, based on environmental conditions, cause something to change. So that's microevolution. Macroevolution would be comparing the end results to each other. But again, there's a lot of history and changes that connect them together. Other things that are kind of easier to wrap your mind around that have also happened on the micro scale to give us macro changes are things like the Grand Canyon. So if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, it's pretty impressive. And that was carved out gradually by the river running through here and wearing away the weaker rock. Sometimes whole boulders would tumble down, so have a big change. Other times it was just one grain of sand at a time to carve out that whole canyon. So those small changes could add up. And my analogy that I've used before, micro evolution is similar to pennies. Most of us don't notice. We don't really care much about pennies. However, if you accumulate enough pennies or those small scale changes over millions of years, it can add up to large changes, so large sums. The pace of evolution is also not constant. So some species, very clearly based on fossil record and other evidence, have evolved gradually. So just gradually through time, they kind of move along at the same pace, changing. And if we graphed that out with, our time and change, that would be a gradual line. So we'll put time. So as time increases, change also increases. Other species evolved by something called punctuated equilibrium. In punctuated equilibrium, you'll have a species that changes very, very little, if at all, over a period of time, and then something dramatic changes in their environment, and then there's rapid change. Now, if you could zero in on this rapid change, rapid in evolutionary terms could still be hundreds of thousands of years. So relatively rapid, looking at our billions of years that we have in our time frame, we still see these intermittent forms, but they happen very quickly, and we get a change. And then perhaps that will be fairly unchanging for a while, and then have another rapid burst. You can see that overall the end result between just constant gradual change and punctuated equilibrium is going to be the same. And these are all determined by environment and genetic diversity and adaptation. So the same species might just gradually change for a while, and then if the environment suddenly changes, they might jump into punctuated equilibrium. So kind of a combination of the two as things evolve and change and adapt over time. The alternative would be extinction. And we have lots of really good examples of things rapidly changing and adapting, and that's called adaptive radiation. This has occurred in the fossil record after mass extinction events. We see a large number of species dying off, followed up by a dramatic increase of diversity of other species. So basically, all the organisms that went extinct left lots of resources available, food and habitat, so the things that survived the extinction can rapidly evolve to take advantage of all of that. Also, colonizing new environments, so new islands, volcanic islands that come up out of the ocean, that's a new environment. So the Galapagos Islands, the Hawaiian Islands are a couple of examples. We've talked about the birds on the Galapagos. These are birds from the Hawaiian Islands. Again, they're all very closely related species. The main differences are their beaks. They've adapted and changed to take advantage of all the different food sources on the island. And then just evolutionary innovations. So insects that had these thermal patches, so regions to help control their temperature that elongated enough to make flight possible. Well, now that opens up a very broad range of habitat that before they could have never reached. And so that allows them to rapidly increase in number and evolve and change and give rise to new species. Extinction, we need to look a little more closely at that. Extinction is a complete loss of species. And there's always a background level of extinction. Some species are just not going to survive. And there have been multiple mass extinctions where large numbers of different species have died off. So there are several mass extinctions. The Great Dying about 250 million years ago, we had over 50% of all species on the planet at that time died off. There have been several others. Kind of the one most people are familiar with is the extinction of the dinosaurs, where that killed off 3/4 of all species on Earth. And currently today, depending on which estimates you go by, because it's kind of hard to monitor it all at one point in time, our current extinction rate is vastly greater than the rate that occurred when the dinosaurs went extinct. So if you look at species that are now going extinct, it's happening faster than when the dinosaurs died off. The 3 domains of life, we've mentioned these before. We've seen them in our kind of chart where we looked at how we classify organisms. We have bacteria, we have archaea, and we have eukaryotes. Kind of putting together all of our information, we know that bacteria were the first to form because they're fairly simple in their body plan. They just have phospholipid bilayer surrounding genetic information. And they existed primarily on the planet alone for long periods of time. And they gradually, depending on their environments they faced, changed into the ancestral archaeon. And now these are kind of the ancestor of all eukaryotes. When you look at bacteria and archaea under the microscope, they look very similar. So they're single-celled organisms, they have the same types of shapes oftentimes. However, at the molecular level, chemical analysis of what they're composed of and how their genetic information works, all of that, we know that they are much more closely related to eukaryotes, and they actually gave rise to eukaryotes. So, even though they look like bacteria, they're actually more closely related to eukaryotes. To give rise to eukaryotes, some of these archaea start incorporating separate free-living bacteria that could metabolize differently. So we've discussed this before in the cell chapter, where they started incorporating bacteria that would function like mitochondria and chloroplasts. And then folding of these layers in here gave rise to nucleus and the other membrane-bound organelles, which gives us our ancestral eukaryotic cell. And we'll talk again about all of these in future chapters. So that's it for your exam 3 material. The exam again is about 70 points. 10 points of that will be review from exams 1 and 2 material. Exam 3 material on our chapter 8 and 10 will be about 60 points of multiple choice and 10 points of short answer. Also, before the exam next Tuesday, we'll do our evolution discussion, so make sure that you have articles to bring with you. So your 2 articles based on evidence for evolution that we talked about in chapter 8, and also type up a preparation for the discussion answering this question. So based on your own background, what you learned in class, and what you learned researching the articles, explain why the theory of evolution, in your opinion, does or does not challenge spiritual beliefs. And there's lots of different spiritual beliefs out there to choose from. And the only requirement here, there's no right or wrong answers, but it must be respectful. So it's okay, whatever you have as your own background is perfectly fine. However, be respectful of what others also have as their background. So have that ready on Tuesday. We'll cover that before the exam.